All right. Was Jean Chretien a good Canadian Prime Minister? This is the outline page. I'll leave a link to the slideshow in my main inquiry submission, so you can see all that. Who was Jean Chretien? Joseph Jacques Jean Chretien was the 20th Prime Minister of Canada, serving in office from 1993 to 2003. He was born in January 1934 and was raised in Shawinigan, Quebec. He also graduated from law school in University Laval. Before his time as Prime Minister, he served under Pierre Trudeau, former Canadian Prime Minister. Chretien served most prominently as Minister of Justice, Minister of Finance, and Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development. He did all this before his time as Prime Minister, and I think he was working under Pierre Trudeau, who was 3 Prime Ministers before him. Fun fact, Jean Chretien was the 18th of 19 children. The election campaign. In the final days of Chretien's campaign, his closest advisors started to become worrisome and anxious. Jean Chretien's campaign was unlike that of Prime Minister Trudeau, who at the time was the best man to lead Canada, at least in the eyes of the people. Yeah, so like I talked about in some of my earlier assignments, Pierre Trudeau, Prime Minister before him, had a way different look, right? Everyone wanted him to be the Prime Minister. They thought he was the best man to be the Prime Minister. He knew, like, the most information to be Prime Minister, everything. It wasn't really like that for Jean Chretien, at least not much so. Even his closest advisors were worried about it, right? I noticed that Chretien, although extremely confident about him winning the campaign, wasn't doing incredibly well in the campaign, at least not compared to some previous prime ministers. However, he was an experienced politician and ended up winning the election with a majority vote. He was announced Prime Minister of Canada on November 4th, 1993. Jean Chretien's ideals and positions as Prime Minister. In 1995, so 2 years after his election, Prime Minister Jean Chretien argued against a major crisis as voters in Quebec. Chretien was strongly opposed to the Quebec sovereignty movement and supported official bilingualism and multiculturalism. Yeah. The independence of Quebec was still a large concern, but the movement towards it had slowed down by the end of the 20th century. I found it interesting that he was against the Quebec sovereignty movement. That's something that looks good to the public, right? It looks good for him being the leader of Canada. Even though he's from Quebec, he was against it. Chrétien's government started focusing on reducing the budget deficit. In 1998, Canada received its first balanced budget since 1970, 28 years. Wow. Jean Chrétien was re-elected in 2000 for his second term as Prime Minister. Below is a photograph of Chrétien winning his second election campaign. I would say he's more confident this time around, right? You can see the flags, Canadian flags, his hands up in the air, everyone's cheering. But still, like how I stated earlier, Jean Chrétien's campaign was unlike that of Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, who at the time was the best man to lead Canada, at least in the eyes of the people. The polls show the Liberals cruising to a majority, which is, of course, how things turned out on November 27th of 2000, from the weakest link by John Geddes. At this point in his second campaign, Jean Chrétien was triumphant, but all too soon. Unfortunately, information regarding a possible scandal involving Prime Minister Chrétien was revealed. Perfect timing, right? It claimed that Chrétien had repeatedly lobbied the Federal Business Development Bank of Canada's president to lend money to a hotel owner. So what I read about this is that he wanted to lend a large sum of money to one of his friends. It was like $650,000 or something like that to one of his friends, and yeah, the information got out, and it didn't look good to the public at all. This information started a controversy among the campaign. The situation did not benefit the public's image of Jean Chrétien. However, the situation must have been considered, well, when I say irrelevant, I mean it just didn't really matter. I don't believe it ended up being against any laws or anything, but it just started some controversy, and the campaign continued, resulting in a majority vote for Chrétien. Globalization. For most of his time as leader, Jean Chrétien seemed to support globalization. We talk about this in the lecture, how globalization is a massive part of the 90s. There's a big shift, right? See a lot of shifts there. like throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, a lot of shift. The New World Order equals globalization, or at least the hope of it. Creighton appeared to see supporting this behavior as his only role, regardless of the consequences. In March 1994, just over 5 months after his election, John, I think it's in 1993. No, 1994. Never mind. Jean Chretien gave a speech arguing that there was no point in lecturing China about human rights because the country of Canada was too small to have influence. He said the Chinese would not listen. He continued and said, "You have to measure your strength. Sometimes you will have influence and sometimes you won't." He said this with confidence, as he does with most things. But uh, some people had some other things to say about it. 6 weeks later, the current Foreign Affairs Minister, Andre Ouellet, I think it's said like that, gave a speech basically correcting Chretien and quotations reasserting Canada's interest in China's treatment towards dissidents. Interesting. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, is a treaty that went into effect in January 1994. Pretty close to right after he was elected, right? It was created and signed between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Quotations. On that day, 3 countries became the largest free market in the world. The combined economies of the 3 nations at that time measured $6 trillion and directly affected more than 365 million people, which a majority of is USA, right? Inc.com. The agreement was, quotations again, created to eliminate tariff barriers to agricultural, manufacturing, and services. In other words, it was made to remove investment restrictions and to protect intellectual property rights. Those are some of the big things that it did, but it did a lot of things around that area, like shipping and purchase between countries and stuff like that. There was a lot of shady things going on in between there, and this corrected a lot of those things. That was the main point. John Chretien originally had his doubts about the changes caused by implementing NAFTA, but he decided to enforce it nevertheless. This is good. Back in 1994, Jean Chretien said that Canada had a surplus of $50 billion a year in trade, which is a lot. Chretien makes a good impression. But why were tariffs such a big issue? Because Mexican tariffs on US made products were on an average 250% higher than US duties on Mexican products. Wow. Now to fix this issue and many others in the system, like I talked about. 250% is a lot higher. That's a big problem. It's a lot of money. So it's definitely a good look for him for implementing that, right? I think it's safe to say that implementing NAFTA was something that benefited Jean Chretien as a public figure and leader. In my opinion, this is something that shows a leader's commitment to the public, something a good leader would do. So, was Jean Chretien a good prime minister? This is quite opinionated, like a quite opinionated question to say, is he a good leader, right? So this is a pros and cons list. Some top things that he did, right? Implemented NAFTA, that's a big one. Big one for his look, at least. Did what he said he would during his election, reduce the budget deficit, widen globalization, which was good for free trade. At times made decisions in being unbiased, such as being against the Quebec sovereignty movement, which is interesting because he's from Quebec, right? That's another good one. Supported bilingualism and multiculturalism, both of which I think are good causes, right? I don't see why not. Promised to create 10 national parks and 5 marine conservation areas. Top cons / negative attributes. Thought of his role as CEO of the Altman Company. That is one of the biggest things, right? He thought of his role as the CEO, not as the leader of Canada, to do what's best for the people. That he was so good at his job that he was in charge, right? Tended to do things for his reasons, not the people's. Those two are connected. Arguably spent a majority of his mandate encouraging trade with any nation interested, doing so in a way where money is in top priority and rules were sacrificed. Conclusion. To answer the question you've all been waiting for, no, I do not think Jean Chretien was a good prime minister. Good for the people, that is. I'm not saying he didn't do anything good for Canada or that he's a bad person, but rather that Chretien had the wrong ideals. He went about his role as if he was the CEO of a company, but that's not what a prime minister is, and it's definitely not what they should be. Jean Chretien was a very respectable and wise politician, and he brought change, New World Order, to the 1990s, but I don't think he was a good Canadian leader. These are the sources. These are your Explorer High School screenshots, Yeltsin Gauge, and Google. I'll leave a link so you can look at these better.